There's a certain kind of ignorance that's pretty hard to see. And I don't mean the kind of ignorance where you don't know something, right? That one's pretty straightforward. You usually know when you know something and you don't. What I mean is the kind of ignorance where you're making assumptions about the way the world is, the way that reality works, and you don't even realize that this is an assumption you make. You take something for granted so completely that you don't realize that this is something you're just assuming. You just think that's the way reality is. That's how it works. It seems completely obvious to you. Basically, all of us live in this condition all the time. And, to a certain extent, that's completely normal. I mean, in fact, it's unavoidable, right? Because we all grow up inside a certain culture. We speak a certain kind of language. And we can't help but absorb a certain kind of seeing the world. And then what happens is we don't realize that the way we were taught to see the world may not necessarily be the way the world actually is, right? But if we're philosophers, then what we're interested in is trying to find out what reality is actually like, right? We don't have any use for any prejudice or any preconceived notions about what reality is. We want to know what it actually is. So before we can even start thinking about the world properly, we have to uncover all those hidden assumptions that we don't even realize are there. And luckily, there's a method for that within philosophy, and that is called genealogy. What is genealogy then? Well, when we usually hear the word, it makes us think of family trees, right? We think of, tracing back the history of our ancestors, of our great-great-grandfather, and so on. That's actually a useful starting point because genealogy in philosophy works in a similar way, but instead of tracing back the history of our ancestry, we are uncovering the history of our ideas, of our beliefs, of our value systems. And the targets of genealogy are always those things that seem the most obvious to us. And that's not a coincidence, because these things that feel the most self-evident, the most trivial, the most natural, they are usually the things with the longest and most hidden histories. They feel obvious precisely because they have been so thoroughly absorbed for such a long time through culture, through institutions, and at some point they stopped looking like ideas that were passed down and they started looking just like reality itself. That's just the way the world is. So by the time they reach us, in a way, they've lost their fingerprints and they no longer look like ideas that somebody had 2,000 years ago. They just look like reality. And genealogy then is the practice of recovering those fingerprints, of asking, when did this begin? Where did this come from? What were the circumstances that produced it? And maybe most importantly, what does knowing its origin tell us about its claim to be true, right? Friedrich Nietzsche was trained as a classical philologist. In fact, he was appointed as the youngest ever university professor at the University of Basel at the age of 24 years old. So he was extremely good at Latin and ancient Greek. He read all of those ancient texts, by the pre-Socratics and by Plato and by Aristotle and so on. And, when you're trained in philology, you are trained to see that language has a history, right? That the meanings of certain words change over time. And that made it, in a way, quite easy for him to see that, the categories that we think with, that they too have a history, that they were not always there, but that you can trace back the history of certain strands of thought. And the move that he made, which was so radical at his time, was to apply those same tools to morality. You know, in that time, morality was pretty much unquestioned. Moral laws, they came either from God or from reason, but certainly not from history. In 1887, he published his book Zur Genealogie der Moral, on the genealogy of morality. And in that book, he asked the question that philosophers had pretty much avoided up to this point, not whether our moral values are good or true, but where they actually came from. And he wrote, Wir haben eine Kritik der moralischen Werte nötig. Der Wert dieser Werte ist selbst erst einmal in Frage zu stellen. Und dazu tut eine Kenntnis der Bedingungen und Umstände Not, aus denen sie gewachsen, unter denen sie sich entwickelt und verschoben haben. We need a critique of moral values. The value of these values should itself, for once, be examined. And so we need to know about the conditions and circumstances under which the values grew up, developed, and changed. So his move was not to immediately attack morality or say that it's wrong or something, but to ask the prior question, you know, under what conditions did these values emerge, right? Who produced them? And what does their particular history tell us about their claim to be universal? And what he found was that these moral values he examined that were treated as eternal and self-evident and obvious, stuff like the distinction between good and evil, or that guilt and shame are good and necessary, or that selflessness is a moral virtue, or the kind of Christian suspicion of power and of pleasure, that they had none of the origin one might expect. They did not come from God or from universal reason, but they came from power struggles. They came from resentment. They came from the accumulated psychology of particular groups in particular historical circumstances. The specific content of what he found, we'll leave that aside for now. It doesn't really concern us that much here, but what matters to us is the method itself, right? The act of turning historical inquiry onto something that had previously been considered beyond history, universal, self-evident and obvious. And Nietzsche had a word for what he was looking for. Nämlich das Graue will sagen, das Urkundliche, das wirklich Feststellbare, das wirklich Dagewesene, kurz die ganze lange, schwer zu entziffernde Hieroglyphenschrift der menschlichen Moralvergangenheit. Namely the grey, which is to say, that which can be documented, which can actually be confirmed and has actually existed. In short, the whole long, hard to decipher, hieroglyphic script of man's moral past. The grey. Not the bright and the certain, right? The grey, the buried, the difficult, the almost illegible. That is where genealogy works, in the hieroglyphic script of the past that nobody has thought to read. And what Nietzsche found when he read it was that our most fundamental assumptions, the ones that we think of as, you know, most obviously true, most natural, most simply there, that these assumptions are not natural at all, that they are the product of struggles and accidents that happened so long ago that we have completely forgotten all about them. And he describes this with a beautiful image that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Mit der Notwendigkeit, mit der ein Baum seine Früchte trägt, wachsen aus uns unsere Gedanken, unsere Werte, unsere Ja's und Neins. Our thoughts, values, every yes, no, if and but grow from us with the same inevitability as fruits born on the tree. They grow from us, from our history, from our conditions, from our inherited ground. We do not choose them any more than a tree chooses its fruit. And that means that before we can think clearly about anything at all, before we can ask what is true or good or real, we first have to ask, what kind of ground are we growing from? What has shaped the soil in which our thinking takes root? I want to pause here for a bit and say something about what it actually feels like when we apply the method of genealogy in a way that actually works. Because it's not like the feeling when you learn a new piece of information. It's more like something that completely destabilizes you, like a kind of vertigo, or like the feeling you get when you say the same word over and over and over again until it starts to lose its meaning, when it starts to sound strange and you're not even sure what it means anymore. That's the kind of thing that happens when you do a real genealogical investigation and your deeply held assumptions about reality start to, collapse. There's a German word for this: Verfremdung, estrangement, making the familiar strange. And that's exactly what genealogy does. It makes the familiar look strange all of a sudden. All these assumptions that you have that used to seem so familiar, so obvious, so self-evident, so natural, all of a sudden they seem a little strange. And you gain a little bit of distance from them. You are estranged from them. And what that enables you to do is you can look at these assumptions and notice that they're there and see what you want to do with them rather than be carried along by them immediately and not even realizing that this is what's happening. And in that sense, this really isn't a purely intellectual exercise, but it's actually quite close to what many contemplative traditions talk about when they speak of waking up, right? Seeing through the constructions that we mistake for reality. Nietzsche applied genealogy to morality, but his method didn't stay there. Michel Foucault, the French philosopher and historian, he took the genealogical method and he showed that you could apply it to, basically anything. So he took it and he turned it on madness, the idea of insanity, right? And he traced how what counts as insane has actually, shifted quite dramatically over the course of history. And that this was shaped less by, new medical discoveries and more by changing social arrangements and institutional interests. He also wrote a genealogy of the prison on punishment and guilt and rehabilitation. And he showed that what we take to be obvious truths about how justice works, these things are also, in fact, quite recent historical constructions. Very famously, he also turned it on sexuality, right? On the very categories through which we understand desire and the way we understand ourselves as desiring beings. So, but in each case, the move is exactly the same, right? You take something that presents itself as, natural and inevitable, and you show that it was made at some point, that it has a history, that other possibilities existed and were lost at some point. What Foucault added to Nietzsche was range. After Foucault, it was pretty clear that you could use genealogy and apply it to virtually any domain of human life, on medicine, on education, on the family, and even on the very concept of the individual self. Now, Gilles Deleuze, one of my absolute favorite philosophers, he was a contemporary of Foucault and in many ways his philosophical partner. He pushed this idea even further and in a direction that is even more important to what we're doing here with this series. Because what he did was, he asked what happens when you turn the genealogical question on itself, right? Not on morality, not on prisons, not on madness, not on punishment, not on sexuality, but on the very act of thinking itself. So he was asking what assumptions are already built into the way that philosophy, and by extension all of us, approach the question of what thinking actually is. Deleuze called this the image of thought, the picture of what thinking is supposed to look like, what it is supposed to do, what counts as a genuine thought and what doesn't. And what he argued was that this image of thought is not neutral, right? It has a history. It reflects specific values and specific ways of organizing our experience. And as long as it remains invisible to us, it shapes everything we think about without us even noticing that. Now, this is going to be one of our methods, one of our lenses that we're going to use in future investigations. And what we're going to do with this is that we're going to apply it on, we're going to turn it on the very assumptions that shape your everyday experience. Not just your moral values, although that too eventually, but I want to begin with something that's even more basic than that. I want to begin with the assumptions that are so fundamental that they do not even register as assumptions to you because they seem so obvious and so self-evident. And these are the assumptions that do not just shape what you think, but the way you see the world, what appears to you as real, as obvious, as simply there. In the videos that follow, we're going to take these assumptions one by one. We're going to examine them. We're going to look at where they came from. We're going to look at who made them. We're going to look at what they displaced. And we're going to ask what it means that they now feel like common sense reality to us. And the very first assumption that I want to tackle is the assumption that the world is made of objects, that reality is something stable, something finished, something that's already there. That feels completely obvious, and that's precisely why I'm going to start there. That is all I have for you today. We covered quite a bit of ground again, and if some of this needs some time to settle, that's completely normal. Let me know what you think. Did you like the video? Did you find anything interesting here? If so, please let me know in the comments, like and subscribe and do all of those YouTube things, If you want to, you can also follow me on my website. The link is in the video description. And as I said, the next time I'll see you, we're going to do the first concrete application of what we were talking about here today. So until then, have a good one, and I'll see you very soon.